The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We don't want to go too late and too long. I'm Kathy Morrison, Director of the Center for International Studies and Professor of Anthropology here at the University of Chicago. Let me welcome you to our fifth and final event in the CIS Spring Quarter Series on food security, food insecurity, access, equity, and frameworks. We've had a great series through the whole quarter, and we're very pleased to have had a quite, I think, successful experiment in linking this public lecture series also to a college course. And so we have our dedicated undergraduates here in the audience who are now good experts on issues of food security. Very timely. Now we're fresh from the G8, and those of us who live in Chicago are happy that we had only NATO and not the G8 to contend with over the last couple of days. But we're very fortunate today to have two distinguished speakers to talk to us about issues of governance and accountability. Our format is first, both speakers will speak, and then we'll have time for audience question and answer. So our first speaker is Julie Howard, who holds a PhD in agricultural economics from Michigan State University, an MS in international economic development from the University of California, Davis, and a BA in international affairs from George Washington University. She's the chief scientist in the USAID Bureau for Food Security, which leads the implementation of Feed the Future, and also serves as senior advisor to the USAID Administrator on Agricultural Research, Extension, and Education. Dr. Howard is the co-author of two books, Investing in Africa's Future, U.S. Agricultural Development Assistance for Sub-Saharan Africa, and the second one, Now is the Time, A Plan to Cut Hunger and Poverty in Africa. Her talk today is entitled From L'Aquila to Camp David, Feed the Future, and the U.S. Commitment to Global Food Security. We're also very fortunate to have with us today Emily Alpert, who holds a BA and an MA in International Relations from the University of Denver. She's the Senior Policy Manager for Agriculture and Food Security at ONE, a grassroots advocacy organization committed to fighting extreme poverty. She leads ONE's advocacy and campaign work on agricultural development and food security issues. Previously, as the Senior Policy Advisor at Oxfam America, Ms. Alpert advised and represented Oxfam on the Doha Development Round, the U.S. Farm Bill, agricultural development, and the impact of biofuels and high food prices on food security. She's also authored several papers and articles on the nexus of trade, agriculture, and development. Today she'll ask, and I hope answer the question, transparency and accountability, have the G8 achieved it? Tonight's co-sponsors include the Global Health Initiative, which I also co-sponsored our April 30th event on food and nutrition with Craig Gunderson and Sophie Milam, and also the University Communications Office. The University Communications has done great work in helping us to record these events, and I'm happy to say that our first two events are now already posted audio and visual on the CIS webpage, so you can check it out there if you missed it. You can also, if you're so inclined, contribute to our ongoing Twitter discussion on all of the events in the series at the hashtag CIS Food Security, all one word. So let's begin first with Dr. Howard.
Great, thank you. Can you all hear me? Not booming? Okay, great. Well, before I get started, I wanted to say thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here, and I'm actually a native of Illinois, although not a native of Chicago. I grew up in downstate Illinois, in Decatur, but I spent summers in Chicago, so it almost feels like home. It's great to be back. And I do work for USAID, Bureau of Food Security now, but I'm a relatively recent arrival. I've been in the US government for just over a year. And before then, as you mentioned, I'm an agricultural economist, worked at Michigan State University for a number of years, but then I spent the last sort of 7 or 8 years helping to incubate a research and advocacy group in Washington called the Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty in Africa. So most days I still feel like I have kind of outside eyes that I look at the work of the U.S. government, as well as increasingly eyes of an insider. So I'm one of those fortunate people, so when the boss calls you up and says, okay, you made so much noise about getting this initiative started on the outside, now come in and help run it, I got the opportunity to say yes. So I wanted to spend some time telling you about what that experience has been like over the past year. So I want to cover 4 basic things in my talk. I want to define food security, although probably most of you know what that is, just in case. And then I'll talk a little bit about what Feed the Future is, this U.S. Global Hunger and Food Security Initiative, and what's different about Feed the Future. Is anything different about it? Then I'll fast forward to last weekend's summit, the almost Chicago summit, and instead the Camp David summit, and talk to you a little bit about what happened relative to food security in the Chicago Camp David summit. And then throughout, I'll try to weave in one of the themes for tonight. You know, what does all this have to do with governance and accountability? And I know Emily's going to pick up on those themes anyway. So what is food security? And I'm only bringing this up because I think at inconvenient times during my career, you know, people that I assumed knew exactly what food security was, having, you know, followed me around and heard me talk endless, they will come up to me and say, like neighbors or, you know, relatives, what is food security after all? So let's just get that off the table at the beginning and say, food security carries an official definition from the 1996 World Food Summit. And it's defined as the state when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food, enough to maintain a healthy and active lifestyle. So note those 3 parts, because we'll come back to that during the talk. Food availability, sufficient quantities available on a consistent basis, access, sufficient resources to obtain appropriate foods for a nutritious diet, and the use aspect, appropriate use based on knowledge of basic nutrition. So now that we've defined food security, why focus on food security now? You know, what's the big deal with food security now? Well, I'm sensing, do you all know what the Green Revolution was? Green Revolution sound familiar? Yes? No? Green Revolution? Maybe yes? No? Okay. All right. The Green Revolution, starting in the 1950s and through the 1970s, this is sort of the last major worldwide transformation of agriculture that we experienced, led by Professor Norman Borlaug, who won a Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his efforts. His particular innovation was figuring out how to breed wheat to breed short stature. So when you put fertilizer on the wheat, instead of growing a huge stalk, you know, instead you got more grain. Huge innovation. And other related innovations made it possible to really dramatically increase the productivity of agricultural lands across the world, and beyond wheat, rice, and combined with irrigation and fertilizer technology, really saved hundreds of millions of people from starvation during that time period. But beginning in the 1970s, I think we, the collective we, grew rather complacent and just assumed that those innovations would keep coming, and agriculture was just one of those things that played in the background. Over time, I guess you could say that success bred complacency. And during the 50s, 60s, 70s, the US government, the US Agency for International Development, was investing quite a lot of resources in agriculture. 20 to 30% of the USAID budget supported agriculture. But during the times of complacency afterwards, by 2006, our support had really dwindled to 3%. And it wasn't just the US government. You know, this is something repeated across all donors and across multilateral agencies. So you saw for Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, official development assistance, about 15% of that during the 1980s went to agriculture, and then had declined to 4% by 2006. So you had this, beginning set up this dynamic, where you've got less going into agricultural development, into technology, and more going to emergency assistance. That was how the U.S. and other countries were addressing issues, these humanitarian crises, etc. We were getting used to sending food aid to fix the problem. So in that period, emergency aid was 4 times agricultural development assistance. Well, that went on, and then in 2007 and 2008, we all got quite a wake-up call. In that time period, we had a period of global food price hikes, which really very sharply arrested sort of our, I would say punctured our dream of all is well in the agriculture world, particularly with rice. Huge price spikes in rice in countries, for example, West Africa and the Caribbean, which had grown quite used to importing large quantities of rice from Asia. All of a sudden, rice stocks evaporated, rice prices went through the roof, and this created instability around the world. Haiti's government fell, instability in about 30 countries. So for the first time, I was explaining earlier this evening, for the first time in my career, which is now about, if I count Peace Corps, I left for Peace Corps from Chicago more than 30 years ago. For the first time, food security, stopped being, one of those things that agriculture and policy wonks think about sometimes. And it started to be an issue connected to national security. We saw it, toppling governments, and all of a sudden, people in Washington who really hadn't paid any attention to agriculture and food security, that I, tried to get them to come to my events at my research and advocacy group, and the health and defense, all those things took greater precedence. But all of a sudden, they took notice. And also, this is during the time, right after the election, that the Obama campaign began to take notice of food security as an issue. And I'll remember during the transition, Emily, you might have been at this meeting. There was a joint meeting with USAID and USDA groups, constituency groups, and they went around the table and asked the Obama representatives long before I came into government and said, what's your number one item for this administration? What's most important? And here were groups, I won't go into this sordid history, but there was quite a divide among food aid groups and agricultural development groups at one time. And because of the food price crisis, in large part of that, those groups began to come together and say, we can't just pay attention to humanitarian assistance anymore. We can't keep fixing it with greater and greater quantities of food aid. We really have to dig down and literally and say, what's the longer term approach that we need to solve these problems? These groups really came together. And so to a person around this like 50 or 60 person table, people said, what's the major issue? Food security, food security, food security. So you saw the importance of advocacy groups, the importance of the moment, when this was really vaulted into the headlines and became a security issue. So what do we know about the problem beyond the food price hikes? So I think that moment revealed to us the need for the international community to make greater investments in agriculture instead of only looking at it as a humanitarian issue. This was a time also that highlighted the parts of the world that had really been largely bypassed by the Green Revolution. First and foremost, sub-Saharan Africa, but also parts of Asia and Latin America. And so we know that today almost 1 billion people, really more than 1/7 of the world's population, suffer from chronic hunger. And most of these people, 98%, live in developing countries. And I think what we've learned increasingly, since the last 5 or 6 years, it's not just a matter of hunger. We now have done the research to understand that when children in their first months of life are malnourished, they are stunted mentally and physically for life. These are things that cannot be replaced. So, we see the hunger, we see the impact on the next generation, and we begin to have sort of political momentum to do something, to invest more, to do something a different way. So, compounding all of these problems, food price, instability, impact on children, malnutrition, we also know that by the year 2050, the world's population is going to increase significantly to more than 9 billion. So we're going to need up to 70% more food by that time. So which is a pretty daunting proposition, given that our yield growth rates have pretty dramatically slowed around the world in the past few years. So before I go in to talk more specifically about Feed the Future, there's also sort of a subtlety that relates to the American perception of need in this area. You know, I think you will all recognize that I mean, Americans are extremely generous people. And, you know, we saw that with the crisis in Haiti. And we see that, you know, with the crisis in the Horn of Africa earlier this year. And we see that with the emerging crisis in Sahel. You know, people want to sort of dig deep and, you know, find money or do something. It's quite an interesting process, you know, to try and to work with the various constituencies to persuade people that that's maybe not always the best approach. You know, that instead, you know, we look at our own development and look how much people benefited by having the resources and assistance to really pull themselves up to develop. I mean, really, that was how our own country developed. But that's not how we've done things, you know, in terms of developing countries, you know, for a few decades now. So a subtle shift, you know, in how we message the importance of helping, you know, but looking carefully at the way we help. You know, are we helping? Are we assisting? Are we doing for? Are we putting people on a path to economic development? Okay. So let me shift now from why food security and food security is important to talking more specifically about Feed the Future. So renewed concerns over food security really culminated in July 2009. So after the food price spikes, after the transition team meetings, and then we have the G8 summit in L'Aquila, Italy, July 2009. If you remember L'Aquila being shattered by an earthquake at that moment. So kind of surprising to many of us still, President Obama led the way for global leaders calling for a significantly increased investment in agriculture and rural development, the kind of this productive foundational investment to increase food security. And President Obama said at that time, you know, I pledge to double the U.S. investment in agriculture and food security. And that commitment was $3.5 billion over 3 years. And this is the commitment that came to be called Feed the Future, the U.S. Global Hunger and Food Security, meant to address the root causes of hunger and undernutrition. Not saying that food aid is not important, but this investment was really to get at those core issues. So through President Obama's leadership, the U.S. pledge helped to leverage and align more than $18.5 billion from other donors in support of a common approach that's defined by 5 foundational principles, quite important principles if you think about governance and accountability. And these are called the Rome principles. And these principles are, I also feel certain that Emily will also talk about these. Okay, thank you. They are, essentially, these are the roadmap for doing, how do you do development a different way? Okay. First, you invest in country-owned plans that support results-based programs. Okay, instead of designing your own programs here and then offering them to the countries, you say, okay, we'll support you to figure out, you know, what it makes sense for you to develop, which sectors you ought to focus on. Invest in country-owned plans. Secondly, strengthen strategic coordination. So it means, you know, we ought to do a better job in the U.S. in coordinating with our other G8 partners. You know, we ought not duplicate. We ought to look at what these country-owned plans are and invest against them according to our comparative advantage, instead of having our stovepiped programs that don't talk to each other at the country level. Third principle, ensure a comprehensive approach. So at the same time as we're advancing agriculture-led growth, we're also reducing undernutrition. Fourth, leverage the benefits of multilateral institutions, so work very much in concert with the World Bank, with the African Development Bank, with the UN World Food Agencies. And five, and I think this is the most important for me, deliver on sustained and accountable commitments. Work towards transparency, put everything up on the web, set an example so that the countries, societies, and other parts of the world will also begin demanding transparency and accountability of the investments that their government makes, their private sector makes. So Feed the Future is the U.S. contribution to this broader global effort to reverse decades of declining support for agricultural development. So what are our goals? I just talked about sustainable and accountable goals. So what are the goals of Feed the Future? Well, they're pretty daunting on some days. Our goal is to assist 18 million vulnerable women, children, and family members, mostly smallholder farmers, mostly women, to help 18 million to increase their incomes over the next 5 years. We also aim to reach 7 million children with nutrition interventions to prevent stunting and child mortality. And over the bucket that I'm directly responsible for, over the next 5 years, our research and development activities are intended to generate more than $3 billion in future agricultural gross development product in our target regions. So what are our target regions? Another innovation of Feed the Future is basically the admission that we can't do everything everywhere. So let's focus on countries where we see a glimmer in the government's willingness to put agriculture front and center and to be accountable to their people. So we have 19 focus countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And these are countries where you have high levels of poverty and undernutrition, but we also believe these are countries where our investments will have an impact. So again, why the focus on agriculture? Well, it's not just about hunger, it's also about reducing poverty. So we know from decades of studies, and just sort of capped by a wonderful study by the World Bank, agricultural growth is the most important key to reducing poverty in the developing world. 75% of the world's poor live in rural areas. So where most people's livelihoods rely on agriculture, if you want to boost them out of poverty, you have to make their livelihoods more productive. So growth in agriculture is on average at least twice as effective in reducing poverty as growth in other sectors. So I want to run through quickly, what makes Feed the Future different. And then I want to sort of close off by saying, well, what's happened between L'Aquila and last weekend's Camp David Summit with regard to food security. So what's different about Feed the Future relative to other development initiatives? Well, first of all, President Obama and Administrator Shah have asked USAID to lead an initiative that's not just USAID-centric, but draws from resources across the government. So on an everyday basis, we're working with not only our USAID colleagues, but also State Department, U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, Peace Corps. And I mean, on the outside, and I have to say before I came into government, I thought, my gosh, how can that ever work? With the different cultures, the different expectations, the somewhat different mandates. But I was recently in Guatemala. And Guatemala is actually one of our missions that's tried very, very hard to bring a whole of government coherence to their programs. And you see it's quite interesting, the impact that you have when USDA is investing in the same areas as USAID, and when you have private sector investment also sort of facilitated, asked to come into the same areas. All of a sudden you've got this incredible dynamic where you've got agriculture interventions, you've got private sector investment. This is Walmart, got NGOs working with Walmart to train farmers to produce fruits and vegetables to standard. You've got USDA programs to help in training on sanitary and phytosanitary regulations. And you see that this is how it's actually supposed to work together. And I think probably sitting in your chairs, you're probably thinking, well, that was self-evident, but the way that the government has been used to working in assistance, it's been very stovepiped, So now on the inside, you see what what a breakthrough it really is. I mean, to begin to put into place the incentives for different agencies to work together, and now we're finally harnessing the fruits of those efforts. Okay, so whole of government initiative. We talked about the Rome Principle, country-led. Long-term effectiveness requires that our interventions are country-led. And we've had quite a lot of progress on that in Africa over the last 5 years, a major initiative called the New Partnership for Africa's Development with Agriculture as its, one of its key platform items. This has been a process supported by the US, the World Bank, other donors. It's provided assistance for countries to develop their own plans, to do the analysis and to say, what is it that we should be doing? Which value chains, and these are commodity chains from research all the way through to production, to utilization and processing, which ones does it make sense for our country to focus on? So we got in many cases, country economists, regional economists, and agronomists to work on these, and got a really interesting process of peer review. So you had an interesting dynamic of countries arriving at their priorities, having them peer reviewed by country and regional experts, answering to each other, right? Instead of answering just to the donors. Is this what you want? Is this what will get us funding? But instead, what makes sense for our country? And I think it really added quite a lot to the level of competence of the people that we're working with, and has created a base for support. It's not perfect. In many cases, these country plans were developed with a little too heavy government hand and not enough civil society consultation. I'm heading Emily off here. And not enough private sector, but we're getting there. We're getting there, and I think it's really made a difference. So we in USAID, we really essentially drove our missions crazy, by saying, look, we are not doing business the same way. We are asking you to go back and revise your program to reflect the country's priorities, but also to look across the U.S. government portfolio and figure out what's USDA doing, what's the Millennium Challenge Corporation doing, and reflect that in your plan. And beyond that, go to other donors and make sure there's no duplication. And it really was. I'm sure still you would go to mission directors today, and over a beer they would tell you that it was pure torture. But that's been a really fundamental shift for us. To be very serious about responding to country-driven priorities, and very serious in trying to create this kind of coordination. Okay, moving more quickly. What else makes Feed the Future different? We talked a little bit about integrated programming before. About the sort of the importance of not just of having agriculture here and nutrition here and health interventions over here, but having them all together and all in the same community. We're beginning to see some payoffs to that as well. So I was reading an article today talking about interventions in Bangladesh, which were a combination of agriculture, health and nutrition interventions with women's empowerment. And it showed that where women received empowerment training, and they were able to assert more dominance in their family over spending, over the things that their children ate, this seemed to be the power variable, according to this study. So women who received that training and received other interventions, nutrition, health, agriculture, their children of these families were significantly less likely to be stunted. So it's quite interesting, and we have pioneered a Women's Empowerment Index, which shows the impact of programs over time, not just on women's income, but on their increase in decision-making authority over household finances, over land tenure. So these are the kinds of things that we're tracking. Third key area, we've realized that we can't do development ourselves. We have to do it against country priorities, but we need partnerships. And particularly, we put quite a lot of emphasis on private sector partnerships, realizing that development assistance, official development assistance, is never going to be enough. we need to work with countries to help create jobs. So we are doing some interesting things like working with Pepsi and the World Food Program in Ethiopia to produce nutritious products made from chickpea. Now, PepsiCo, you may or may not know, produces a lot of hummus, the Sabra brand. So they're actually working on creating a kind of hummus, a nutritious spread for Ethiopia. So for use in feeding camps, but also, they plan to develop it as a snack food. So you're creating a market, for a local. Chickpeas are a staple of the Ethiopian diet. You're working on the productivity as well. Okay, maybe just skip over really quickly. Rigorous measurement and evaluation systems. USAID used to have, top-notch monitoring and evaluation systems that really fell over the past 20 years, and we're building that back up. And we've developed a comprehensive results framework that essentially compels all of our programs, all of our missions, to answer the question, what exactly does your program do in terms of meeting our top-level goals that I explained on poverty and undernutrition. Okay. I want to talk just a little bit about capacity development, because we are at the University of Chicago, and you all probably are all too young to remember this, but played a pretty interesting role in developing the capacity of macroeconomists in South America decades and decades ago. So that continues to be very, very important for us. Although, to be honest, we work nowadays mainly with land-grant institutions, but not only. We're doing quite a lot of innovative work with MIT and Harvard, and sort of harnessing internet technologies, ICT, figuring out how to integrate different kinds of data sets to work out agriculture and climate change issues. So the universities have been very, very important partners with us in terms of training, developing country students, but also helping us get a handle on some of the key issues. The project that I worked with at Michigan State did a lot of policy analysis, training analysts at the country level, but also looking at different models for technology diffusion, and what happens when you have issues with fertilizer prices and seed availability. An interesting thing, I think, is happening now. We're starting to see a turnover in generations of universities. So, back during the Green Revolution, we put a lot of effort into training Indian universities, so setting up Indian universities, and also Brazilian universities. So these are very, very important collaborations. I think in India ended up with about 500 new institutions as a result of USAID. And now we're seeing that those same countries are now beginning to provide assistance themselves, and in a different way, and in many times more effective way than our own institutions can provide. So we're actually facilitating strategic partnerships between Brazil's research entity, Embrapa, and Mozambique, and I think they're also working in Honduras now to provide agricultural training and sort of research assistance. India is beginning work in 3 different countries. Really interesting things going on. And I want to say for students, we at USAID, I can't close this talk without first of all talking about Camp David, but also talking about how with this new page that we're turning with USAID, we're on the hunt for new young people, for professionals to enter this field. And I was telling someone the other day, my gosh, I'm starting to feel really old walking down the corridors. As part of the preparation for the G8, we put together a series of lightning talks with key innovators. So many of these are folks who are working in the world of cyber security. The folks who are figuring out, before we have an inkling, that so-and-so terrorist is on the move because they have a link to a security cam and the person's bank account, and they're tracking these moves. It's possible for us to use these same technologies in figuring out new and better ways of identifying where should we be targeting our technologies. How do we integrate databases from our major research institutions, from weather satellites, to give us, in the blink of an eye, information that used to take us weeks or, months to process. So all these things are changing. The way that farmers are getting information around the world is changing. Cell phones are revolutionizing the world in Africa. People are getting market prices that way. Increasingly they're going to be getting other kinds of information, being able to get access to loans. We really need young, smart people to help us on this. So there are many interesting fellowships and internships and career opportunities at USAID, and I hope you'll encourage your students as well to visit the careers tab on the USAID Gov website to learn more. Well, let me close with just a few reflections on this journey that we've made from L'Aquila. I've told you a lot about that and how we have followed up in the U.S. government on living up to President Obama's pledge at L'Aquila. So then, what's happened now with Camp David? Well, for some of my colleagues, the administrator came down we're on the second floor, he came down from the 6th floor yesterday, and he came down to visit with us and talk a little bit about Camp David and, give us the inside scoop on who was there and how many times the presidents mentioned USAID. Really it was a very, very important moment for us because G8 summits, are normally something that's held very, very close by the White House. World Bank, the White House controls everything. This time is different. President Obama asked Administrator Shah, to take the lead on an important part of the G8 portfolio. Of course, what you read in the newspaper is the G8 summit and its deliberations on austerity or growth in Europe, but there's also always an Africa platform, the tradition of an Africa platform in the G8 discussions. And this is the part that USAID was given to coordinate with other interagency colleagues. So frankly, many of us have spent most of the last 6 months working out, well, what would that agenda look like? What is the next step? How do we build on this solid base of L'Aquila, and take it a notch up? Well, let me talk a little bit about, our analysis, our joint analysis as donors, our analysis with our country partners. What did we achieve? What have we achieved with L'Aquila? Well, we talked a lot here tonight about how that really marked a turning point. And we saw new financial commitments, the $22 billion. We saw the pledge to do this with country-driven principles. And development partners have indeed made robust commitments, and this $22 billion, we're fairly confident that most countries will reach those commitments by the end of the year. But, stepping back, honestly, we know that significant challenges remain. The national agricultural investment plans that were made by our African leaders and others, they remain inadequately funded. Just small parts have been funded. So donor resources, even though they've increased, they're still not sufficiently aligned against what countries said that they would like to do. Donors still are devoting many more resources to relief than to these foundational agricultural investments. So the lessons. We still have a ways to go in terms of increasing our efficiency and improved alignment at the country level. And really a huge takeaway for us over the past few months is just this, we can't do it alone. We can't do it with official funding only. We must get more private sector investment in. On the sub-Saharan Africa side, we've also seen significant progress. We've seen those government investments in agriculture increase since 2003 really, but really picked up since 2009. 30 countries have now established their own national investment plans. We've had this peer review process I was telling you about. But what are the challenges? Still, many countries that set a target of 6% growth rate by 2015, still well out of reach for many of them. Still don't have a very good systematic approach to establishing an enabling policy environment. Still don't have very much private sector investment. So President Obama personally announced on Friday what our new initiative would be in this space. It's called the Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. And this aims to achieve sustainable and inclusive agricultural growth. And if we think that we have ambitious targets for Feed the Future, the target here is 50 million people helped out of poverty over the next 10 years, 50 million people. So what are sort of the headlines of this approach? What's different in this approach? Big emphasis now on better engagement with the private sector. And during Friday's summit, we had the announcement that 45 private sector companies, African companies, multinational companies, had submitted letters of intent for investment of well over $3 billion for countries in Africa. So private sector investment on the table. 3 sets of actors, 3 different kinds of commitments. This alliance is starting small, starting with 3 countries, 3 sort of proof of concept countries. These are Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Ghana. Different kind of approach. These are countries that have their country determined plans, but they haven't really got to the point of saying, well, these are the policy changes that we think are most important, and this is what we commit to. Well, these are the top line priorities for our investment. For these 3 countries, we negotiated with these countries and with our G8 partners. So we have those cooperation frameworks, very tailored cooperation frameworks for each of those three countries now in place. We have those for 3 countries. We have investors lined up. We've committed resources. Other G8 countries have committed resources. These 3 countries, we have another 3 waiting in the wings to finish their cooperation frameworks. That's Mozambique, Burkina Faso, and Cote d'Ivoire. But just, you can see, I think, the trend. Greater private sector investment, and then much greater focus on what's the accountability and coordination going to be among the donors. What's the accountability going to be for the private sector? Are they delivering against their commitments? And what is the accountability going to be for the country itself? They're committing things like, so the fertilizer companies are committing things like establishing a new fertilizer facility in East Africa. Or Vodafone in East Africa is committing to setting up a network to allow farmers to use mobile technology. Countries are committing to revise their grain trade policies so that they no longer will allow export bans. So farmers will have an incentive to increase their production, knowing that they'll be able to sell beyond their borders. So those are the things. I think now it's going to be very, very interesting over the next few months to see how this rolls out, because we're now very busy figuring out, well, now how does all this get set up at the country level? The first country implementation meeting will likely be held in Tanzania. So, yeah. Okay, well, I think I will close there. But it's really, I think it's been a very, very exciting time over the past really 5-6 years. Sort of the lead up to the food price crisis, seeing the response, seeing the change of food security being kind of a sideline issue to being something that's seen as more central to national security, seeing this real shift to country leadership, but then the realization that it's not only official investment that counts, it's private sector investment. If you want to create sustainable growth, sustainable jobs in countries, the game is really attracting the right kind of private sector investment, enabled by the right kind of policies and right kinds of public sector investments in roads, etc. And then tracking, what was the result? Smallholders out of poverty, women and children lifted out of malnourishment. So I think we'll all be watching very closely, but it's been really very, very interesting transition over the past few years. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, we get the technology shifted over. Now we'll hear from Emily Alpert.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you to the university for having me here tonight. I'll get going while this is still warming up. I'm going to take a little bit of a different perspective on what Julie talked about. She focused a lot on what the U.S. is doing, and I'm going to talk a bit more about what the G8 has done collectively and whether or not they were accountable to their promises to reduce poverty and food insecurity. And I want to take a little bit of time as well to unpack some of these terms. In policy circles, we like to use a lot of jargon and acronyms that don't really mean anything to anyone but ourselves. And it's really kind of unfortunate sometimes that we do that. For us, it's simpler for us to communicate with each other. But then at the end of the day, the public doesn't really know or understand what's being debated in capitals and what decisions their governments are taking and whether or not they're following through on their promises. So before I get to talking about the trajectory of the G8 promises and whether or not they were accountable to them, what happened at Camp David this last weekend, I want to point out that what I really want to talk about today is the power of voice and the ability to have the power to use your voice to hold your governments accountable to their promises and to ensure that they're making smart choices about public policies. So the ability to know what's going on in your government and to be able to have an opinion about it, to have a voice about it, I believe is really fundamental to our society's norms and our values, and that these rights really shouldn't be denied to anyone else. And so, in my eyes, this is really a foundation of democracy and a necessary element for economic development. So I don't think that the ability to be able to use your voice should be taken very lightly, and nor do I think that poverty is something that should be taken lightly. There are 1.4 billion people in this world that live in extreme poverty. This is 20% of the world's population that lives on less than $1.25 a day. I personally find this number really unfathomable. We try to kind of bring it into perspective by saying, well, that's 4.5 times the population of the United States. But at the end of the day, it's really hard to comprehend, and it's also unconscionable. And I believe we all have a responsibility to do something about it, and that's where my voice comes in and where your voice comes in. So if you're fortunate enough to be able to have a voice and to use your voice to hold your governments accountable, then I believe it's a luxury that you shouldn't put to waste. So I want to show you a bit about how you can be a part of a global movement to reduce poverty and food insecurity by holding governments accountable to their promises. And here I have a short video about what it means to do this.
There's a fire starting in my heart, reaching a fever pitch and it's bringing me out the dark.
Millions of people in the world's poorest countries remain in prison. They are trapped in the prison of poverty. It is time to set them free.
We know what it costs, we know what to do. Do it. Do it.
A relatively small amount of money from the rich nations of the world could simply change history.
A new kind of entrepreneurial activism, nonpartisan, hard-headed, focused on results.
I am so proud of the One campaign. You guys have been everywhere, and it's really made a difference in terms of raising awareness, making presidential candidates focus on the issue.
The presence of One in Africa provides us with a new opportunity that can take the work that we have been doing and translate it into greater influence.
Britain has a moral responsibility to help the world's poorest people.
Chatontonne, qu'est-ce qui nous prouve que ça marche?
Famine is the real obscenity.
Because our voices were heard, millions more of our brothers and sisters are alive.
Now this is quite an incredible thing. What I consider the most beautiful picture ever.
In just 10 years, over 15 million more kids are alive, and over 46 million more kids are in school.
When aid is focused on poor people, when it's done properly, it works.
Yes, there are many obstacles, but God will put a wind at our back and a rising road ahead. If we work with each other as one.
So I believe that actions really do speak louder, and that's why it's so important for our governments to follow through on their promises. It's also our job to hold their feet to the fire, and we can't do this without having all the facts. So this is where transparency comes in. And transparency is about making information available. Accountability is about making use of that information to hold decision makers to account for their promises. Now, why do we care about transparency and accountability? What does it have to do with poverty reduction? Well, essentially, transparency and accountability help to make aid effective. And I think we're always looking to make things more effective, to be faster, lighter, cheaper, smaller. And no matter what perspective you're coming from within the field of foreign aid, whether you're a lobbyist, an advocate, you work for the government, you work for an NGO, we all want to see results. We all want to make sure that aid dollars are put to use and that they're as effective as possible. So even though only less than 1% of the entire US budget is spent on foreign aid, transparency and accountability are absolutely essential, if not indispensable, particularly in today's economy. But it's not just that aid dollars are well spent, but it's about making sure those aid dollars make a difference. And transparency and accountability can help make sure that resources are invested effectively to meet the needs of poor people. So this means that people in need are able to get access to healthcare services, to be able to have an education, or to be able to get the resources they need to become more productive farmers. But even more importantly, transparency and accountability can enable communities and populations in developing countries to hold their own governments accountable. And when they're able to actually take control of their own development, and they can have a voice and a say about how the resources of their governments are being spent and whether or not their governments are keeping true to their promises, they can actually get to a point where they don't need development assistance any longer. And we like to think of this as the end of aid and what we're all ultimately trying to work towards. But for now, we're in a place where we have 1.4 billion people in poverty, and we need to make sure that we are using transparency and accountability to make our aid dollars as effective as possible to break the cycle of hunger and poverty. Now, there's a lot of actors in this space that can contribute to realizing that goal, and not least of which are developing country governments themselves. But I believe that they need a good example to learn from, and I believe that that's where the G8 comes in, that they need to set a good example for developing countries, especially when it comes to investing in agriculture and nutrition. Now, 2/3 of the world's poorest people rely on agriculture for their incomes. 3/4 of Africans rely on agriculture for their incomes. And earnings in agriculture account for about an average of 30% of GDP across most countries in the African continent. And at the same time, you have 178 million children under 5 around the world who are stunted. They're malnourished. And the impacts of undernutrition leaves children vulnerable to infectious diseases, to chronic diseases. It impairs their cognitive function and physical growth. It reduces their lifetime earning potential, increases their lifetime healthcare costs, and leaves their communities less resilient. The damage to their minds and to their bodies is also irreversible. So if you don't do anything about it, usually before the age of 2, there's nothing that can be done. And the costs of addressing undernutrition and likewise investing in poverty are far less expensive than actually dealing with the problems once they erupt. And so if you think about, as Julie said, most people living in rural areas relying on agriculture for their incomes, that if you want to reduce poverty, you really need to go where poverty is. And so that is working in rural communities. It's working with smallholder farmers, many of whom are also women. And so getting to rural areas and making sure that the investments in agriculture are actually targeted towards the needs of those that they're intended to help is critical. So when you get all of this right, when you make smart investments in agriculture and nutrition, you enable smallholder farmers to generate an income. They're able to afford clothing, shelter, education, and even more nutritious food. It helps them to lift their communities out of poverty for the long term. And this is what we like to call the multiplier effect. It's why growth from agriculture can be 2 to 4 times more effective at reducing poverty than growth from any other sector. And so you can see from this diagram that when you get all of this right, you can create a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious one. But I'd like for you to hear for a moment, not from me, but from someone that's actually been a recipient of smart investments in agriculture and how it's changed her life for the better. Just make sure the volume's up. Is the volume working? I don't think so.
I was born here in Mosonge. I am 43 years old and have 5 children and 4 grandchildren. I used to sleep on a rag on the floor with my children. Then I met USAID. USAID gave me new seeds and taught me how to farm this orange sweet potato. She taught me about soil irrigation, about crop multiplication, about dividing vines, the things we didn't know before. She also taught me about selling my crop. Customers ask me why my potatoes are different in color. I tried to explain to them that they are orange because they have vitamin A, which provides protection in the body and are good for kids and adults growing. So customers get excited and buy from me. Now we sell seeds, chips, biscuits, donuts, flour, and even pancakes, all made from sweet potatoes. I work happily knowing that I will be getting out of poverty by doing what I am doing. And when I sleep, all I think about is the potatoes. The dream is always the same. To finish the house I am building of brick stones, to sleep in a comfortable place, and to raise the standard of living for my children and grandchildren and send them to school. I am happy the sweet potato farming is helping my dreams come true.
Now, not everybody is quite as lucky as Maria is. As Julie talked about the decline in development assistance to agriculture, that most farmers in the developing world has actually been neglected. Both figuratively and literally, they've been left in the dust. They suffer from many challenges such as soil erosion, desertification, and drought. And also, as Julie spoke about, the Green Revolution didn't really reach Africa. And so this left many farmers very ill-equipped to handle the ups and downs of farming on a good day. If you guys aren't very familiar with farming, it's an incredibly risky business. Depends a lot on the weather, which we know we're not very good at predicting. And then it also makes it nearly impossible for them to be able to weather extreme events like economic crises or droughts. So the failure to invest in agriculture in the developing world is identified as one of the underlying causes of the 2008 global food price crisis. And this is where food prices doubled, nearly tripled, shoving millions into poverty. And for the first time in recorded history, there was more than 1 billion people suffering from food insecurity around the world. And more than 30 countries broke out with civil unrest. And this is because poor people in developing countries and smallholder farmers as well spend between 60 and 80% of their incomes on food. So this is basically everything that they have is spent on eating. And when the price of food goes up, they have to make a lot of really hard choices. They have to just think about, do I eat less? Do my kids eat less? Do we eat less nutritious food? Do I have to sell off other household assets like livestock or maybe farming equipment in order to be able to give my kids their next meal? And often the answer to those questions is that you have to do all of them. And it essentially keeps people locked or trapped into a vicious cycle of hunger and poverty. This is here just a quick chart showing you how drastically investments in development assistance to agriculture dropped over the last couple of decades. Now, in response to this global food crisis, the G8 came together in 2009 in L'Aquila, Italy, and they launched the L'Aquila Food Security Initiative. And as part of this, the G8 pledged to act with the scale and urgency needed to partner with vulnerable countries and regions to help them develop and implement their own food security strategies, and together sustainably increase sustained commitments of financial and technical assistance to invest in those strategies. Now, the G8 plus Australia, the European Commission, the Netherlands, Spain, and Sweden also promised to do a number of other things. They said, we're going to spend $22 billion over 3 years to tackle these problems. We're going to agree to a new set of principles about how we're going to deliver these funds, and we're going to remain transparent and accountable to our promises. Now, Julie spoke about the Rome principles, so I won't go into them in too much detail, but they were, as she said, meant to guide the way in which these funds were spent. And they're also meant to maximize the impact of these dollars. Resources are clearly very, very tight, and we need to make sure that we're maximizing our investments. And so they said, okay, we're going to adhere to these 5 principles of country ownership, strategic coordination, take a comprehensive approach, work to improve multilateral organizations, and sustain our commitments. So what this all kind of really meant was, well, it's time to listen and not necessarily to talk. That development solutions need to come from the bottom up, and developing countries need to create their own plans, and then the G8 will come in and support these plans, and that they would also then undertake a number of steps to make sure that their aid was coordinated to minimize gaps and overlaps in development assistance, to make sure that not just short-term solutions, but that also long-term solutions were being invested in, and that they would work better with multilateral agencies, and that these multilateral agencies themselves would become more effective at what they were doing, and to ensure that the decline in spending that occurred over the 80s and 90s wouldn't happen again. And then they also said, we're going to produce an annual accountability report. And they did this in 2010 and 2011. And again, this is actually really innovative for the G8. They've never done anything like this before. And so they were really finally starting to take a new path to being transparent and accountable to their promises. But the question is really how good were these reports? And unfortunately, they weren't great. Some of their inherent challenges had to do with the construct of the initiative itself. So it's very hard to measure what the G8 were doing and whether or not they were making promises against their promises, because they all subscribed to different pledge years. They had different ways of making pledges. Some agreed to give their aid in disbursements, which meant that the money would get on the ground within those 3 years. Others agreed to commitments, was a contractual obligation so that the money will get to the ground, but it's just a question as to when. And they also did not identify a baseline for spending. They said, okay, we need to increase spending on agriculture and food security, but they never really said where they started from, so it's very difficult to measure whether or not they actually did increase their spending. And then within the report itself, the content was a bit lacking. The examples about what G8 countries were doing to address these problems were sparse, anecdotal, and inconsistent across the board. Likewise, they didn't really do a great job of measuring their progress against the Rome Principles. And lastly, this information you're not able to independently verify it. So it's hard to say, okay, well, it's just the G8's word that we need to rely on in terms of reading these reports and hoping that what they're saying is accurate. So at one, we decided to try and measure the G8 ourselves. And in June of 2011, we wrote our own accountability report to try and make the point that it was possible to actually present all of this information, that it was possible to measure the G8 against consistent standards and criteria. And we did it 2/3 of the way through the 3-year promises to kind of do a little bit of a temperature check about how the G8 was doing. So this was in July of 2011. The G8 had only dispersed 22% of the funds that they had promised. And in our view, the G8 did not really take the Rome Principles to heart. We felt that the G8 and the other major donors that participated in this initiative were not approaching agriculture and food security with the urgency that they deserved, and that a major injection of political will and good faith was needed without further delay to leverage support from other donors, recipient country governments, and the private sector. And I want to point out just quickly that the U.S. is not the whole of the G8, and the U.S. Feed the Future initiative really was a very strong and concerted effort by the Obama administration to live up to these Rome Principles. Everything about Feed the Future was actually designed to align with the U.S.'s L'Aquila food security commitments. And while the U.S. hasn't met all of its financial commitments, a lot of that has been because of challenges in Congress and efforts to reduce spending. And this is, again, as I spoke about earlier, this is a place where your voice can come in. You can make a difference about this issue by talking to Congress and telling them how important it is that you think that they live up to their promises and that they do provide adequate funding for the Feed the Future program. Now, getting into the accountability of the G8 in terms of what their progress has been like, now that we are 3 years out from the L'Aquila Food Security Initiative, and where we are today with the Camp David Summit. So we identified a number of shortcomings in the G8 accountability reports and in some holes or gaps, if you will, in the initiative itself. And so one said it's really important that the G8 start investing in country-owned plans. You already have it as a principle. It's core to making this initiative a success. It really needs to be prioritized. And it's time to start setting some goals. It's not just enough to throw money at this problem, but that our efforts need to be coordinated and they need to be strategic. And so we want to try and set a goal of lifting 50 million people out of poverty. And then we need to take on board nutrition and get some goals around that. And so we said to the G8, you should make a commitment of saving 15 million children from stunting. And really make sure that these investments are reaching those that need it the most. So these are the smallholder farmers and these are the women. And that you need to set the $22 billion pledge that was made 3 years ago as a baseline for spending so we can measure your progress going forward. And that, of course, that the transparency and accountability of all of your efforts needs to be improved. It needs to be measured and monitored against consistent criteria and standards for all of the L'Aquila donors. So how did the G8 do? Well, you've heard a lot from Julie about the emphasis of this year's food security initiative around the private sector and trying to incentivize private sector investments into African agriculture. And private sector investment is sorely needed. Farmers are business people. Functioning markets and services provided by private sector companies, whether it's seed producers or transportation companies, banks to provide credit, these are all necessary components in terms of making markets function and enabling smallholder farmers to be able to earn an income through selling their goods in these markets. But I think the question here is whether or not this new focus of the initiative actually really helps the G8 improve their accountability and their transparency. So I took a little time to, in my own opinion, rate how the G8 has done against the goals that one set out for it. So, you know, the G8 this year, they committed to lifting 50 million people out of poverty over 10 years. And this is a really important step that they've taken because, again, I think we all need to be working towards goals and an objective to make sure that we're maximizing the resources that are going into this initiative. But they didn't agree to a target on stunting. They have recognized the importance of nutrition and said that they're going to be supporting a variety of different initiatives for improving nutrition in developing countries, but they didn't set any specific goals about what they were going to do, how they were going to do it, so that, to me, isn't really necessarily fulfilling that objective. Now, whether or not they're going to back country-owned plans, I think, is a little questionable. There are private sector cooperation agreements that are committed to being aligned with country priorities, but there are not. It's not necessarily a given that they will be investing in these country plans, and it's also. I'm going to skip down a little bit to the sustained commitment to agriculture and food security. The G didn't actually say that they were going to continue to invest in agriculture with a specific dollar amount or over a specific time again, and they didn't say, you know, where they were starting from and where they were going to. And so the question is, if all of their efforts are being put into enabling private sector investment, which again I think is a positive thing, we want to make sure that they're not also forgetting the public investments going into these country-owned plans. And again, depending on what they do and to what extent that these plans are invested in, will determine whether or not they're reaching smallholder farmers and women. And with respect to transparency and accountability to their promises, the G8 accountability report that came out from the Camp David Summit, this was actually a huge improvement over what was done at Muskoka in 2010 and in Deauville in 2011. The G8 this year, they did measure themselves against the Rome Principles. They did provide very detailed information about exactly what types of programs and projects they're funding. But it's still not independent. You still can't independently monitor what the G8 are doing. And so that's why I think that collectively, I think they're on the right path, but they still have a ways to go. And I think, hopefully, maybe if you ever get involved in advocacy, you'll understand that change takes time, and that holding governments accountable to their promises requires a lot of perseverance. And as I started this talk, I said this was really about the power of voice, the ability to have the power to use your voice. And so at One, we're asking our 3 million members to use their voices in a campaign called Thrive. And Thrive calls on each and every one of us to play our parts to break the cycle of hunger and poverty. And we're going to continue to be calling on the G8 leaders, other donors, African country governments, and private sector companies to back these 30 plans that exist within some of the world's poorest countries. And we know that these plans are tested and they're costed, they're affordable, and they need to be put into action. And we believe that this takes a lot of leadership, financial backing, and accountability, and we're going to continue to insist on all of them. But we know that leaders won't necessarily do that unless we continue to urge them to do so. So we're continuing to build an unstoppable movement with our voices. And here's a little tagline from our campaign that is actually very moving to me, so I thought I'd share it with you. And it goes, most people would do anything if they could help just one hungry child. Together, we could stop malnutrition, not just for one child, but for 15 million. We can end poverty, not just for one person, but for 50 million. Together, we can break the cycle. And so I'd like to know, will you be using your voice to help us? Thank you.
Okay, we do have the opportunity for a short period of audience question and answer. And if you're interested in asking a question, I would ask you to please come to one of the 2 microphones on the side of the room because we're recording tonight's event. So we'd like to get the questions recorded also, as well as the answers. So don't be shy. Jump right on up there. Yes.
Are you okay? So first I want to say thank you for bringing this out. I like to say put it out on the table. We talk about food, we think of the table. I'm actually really concerned because, again, I appreciate and I respect reading your background. And I'm really concerned because we have not talked about the deep issues that are really involved when it comes to poverty alleviation. And I'm motivated to stand up here based on actions speak louder than words, or use your voice. So I want to know how USAID is addressing NAFTA, trade, agriculture law that we know definitely has been hurting these populations that we say would help. For example, USAID in the past has definitely worked on exporting products like wheat, corn, soy. They're based on these 3 commodities, and how much of the work that's being done is correcting those past wrongs from previous policies, from exporting food to countries who we know have the ability and the knowledge, but farmers have known how to farm for many years, centuries, I should say. So to come out and say that we need to train women, it's great, empower women, yes, there are definitely issues within the culture, but I think I would like to know how previous laws, especially agricultural laws, and previous policies have been corrected that we know are doing more harm than good. So we can create new programs all we want, but we still have those same policies and same trade policies, international food law in place. We're never going to do it because on the surface it sounds good, it sounds nice, we're doing something, but and then also forcing countries to produce monocultures, crops that are used for exporting. That's a huge problem too. So I think we have to take a step back and see what policies, in the past were actually doing more harm than good. And I'm not the only one with these ideas. There's groups like Via Campesina. There's a lot of farmer organizations around the world that are heavily against the World Bank for very legitimate reasons. They're not crazy hippie people. Okay, and I'm glad you were in Guatemala because Rigoberta Menchú is also voicing her concern about these policies. So if we want to feed the future, let's start with what they were already doing and give respect. And the other concern is land grabbing. Okay, corporations are too centralized. Food corporations. I think another big issue that we need to talk about is the decentralization of the food supply. I know you talked that it's important to partner with private organizations. Well, that's another big scary thing, I think. When we have seeds that are patented seeds, that they're trying to control the life by giving people seeds that later do not, they're relying on irrigation. I mean, that's another issue. I'm sorry, I just wanted to say those three things. That one, partnering with private sector is a scary business because, the World Health Organization director is now the policy director for PepsiCo. They call it the revolving door. When you have people from Monsanto in the FDA and the USDA, you wonder whose interest is really at heart, is weighing in here. So, that's all.
Yeah, let me just quickly interject to say that this microphone is not working, so if you have a question, please come to this one. So would you like to, we'll just go ahead.
Sure. Okay. Well, thanks for that. I'm not sure that I can, those were a long list of questions, and I hope Emily will weigh in as well. Yeah, there you are back there. So I'm not quite sure of all the past policies that you're talking about, the U.S. policies. Could you be more
I can send you a lot of websites that really specifically address those.
But which?
For example, in the past, it's known that USAID has exported products and relied heavily on exporting aid when the countries themselves can produce it. Okay, another problem is shipping food. It's a problem when you have famines. I mean, I remember growing up in the 80s. I remember seeing the Live Aid concert, Bono, and all these. That actually motivated me to get into nutrition. My background's in nutrition. I've been very fortunate to have traveled to different parts, Africa, South America, and really rural parts. And I tell you, these countries are not the images that we see. With the arid, the climate change. I mean, that is a problem. But the plethora of resources that are there. They have natural resources that we don't have here in the States. I think the big problem too is the erosion of biodiversity. They've known for centuries how to integrate multiple crops together, and that keeps the soil rich. So why is the U.S. insisting on these technologies that only enhance the profits and the bottom line for the private sector? And you talk about PepsiCo creating this product, chickpeas in it. It's amazing because here when we talk about obesity, it's about creating a product, a weight loss product. And we know through environmental issues like having access to physical activities and having access to fruits and vegetables. I think that USAID should definitely look at the policies in place, like I said. I don't want to take anyone else's time, but I know that I can be more than happy to send you a list of things that can be corrected. Exporting food, forcing countries to concentrate on monocultures for exports. And then the whole issue of biofuels.
Great, okay, let me take a stab. Thanks for your comments. I think, you're right in part that one of the byproducts of the Green Revolution, was an overemphasis on monoculture. But back when I got started in this business in the 1980s, there was already a movement called Farming Systems Research, looking at, getting away from monoculture and looking at, what are the local mixes of varieties, of crops, and how do things interact with to keep the soil fertile, to conserve moisture. And really, I would say one of the most important revolutions that we've had most recently in terms of agriculture and agronomy and sustainability is the notion of conservation agriculture, which is much reduced tillage, not disturbing the soil. It's also paying much more attention to the mixes of crops and what kind of mulching to both increase organic matter to the soil and also to keep weeds down naturally. So I think we've come a pretty far way, even in our own programs in USAID in not promoting monoculture. In fact, the research program, which is in my shop, possibly our biggest innovation over the last 3-4 years is really to put sustainable intensification at the center of our programs. And I spent about 3 weeks earlier this year going to our sustainable intensification programs in 3 sites in Africa. And that was about pulling together the International Ag Research Centers, our university scientists that we work with in the U.S., with developing country scientists, and learning, from the local systems and trying to understand, set up a research program so that we understand what technologies can and should be introduced, how do they interact with the local cropping patterns, what's better, not just different. So I think we're on a fair way past the monoculture. In terms of shipping food abroad, I think that's actually also one of the innovations that we can be proud of over the last several years. In the last Farm Bill, one of the key innovations that we won on the outside, were some tweaks to the Farm Bill, which allowed more experimentation around, instead of shipping U.S. food, freedom to buy more locally. And that's really taken off. A program called, implemented with the World Food Program, the UN agency, and working with many countries, especially in Africa. Uganda is one of the biggest programs. So we're giving much more assistance in cash, and we're working on the ground with farmers, with trainers, with folks who are helping with marketing, to purchase food even for relief camps locally. And that includes not just the normal staples, but also rations of local foods. So I think we are seeing a transition away from what's good for Illinois is good for Africa, and instead a greater sensitivity to what's the local diet, but also scientifically looking at what are the needed changes that we need to introduce. As far as the GM question, it's quite interesting. I was in Tanzania earlier this year, and Tanzania, even on the outside, I've been quite proud of USAID and US government policy in this area. And we've said that we are not going to push biotechnology on any country. We're instead going to put our resources into A, training, developing country scientists, and B, setting up a robust regulatory framework, helping countries do that so that they are equipped to make their own decisions about whether to use biotechnology, and that they have local scientific expertise to inform those decisions. So in Tanzania, which has been a country that's been very I'd say reluctant to do anything beyond test on confined area and university space. I opened a conference with the Minister of Agriculture, and totally unexpectedly, he said, in Tanzania we've had a difficult time thinking about biotechnology or thinking about how we're going to use this in our programs. He said, but climate change is changing our minds, because we're seeing the potential of genetically modified seeds to help us come up with varieties that can withstand withstand drought, that can use fertilizer more efficiently, that will be important for us. And he said it's time for us really to begin opening up to this technology, and he committed to starting immediately with cotton. So I think it's, we have to look at that whole issue with a bit of subtlety. One that, again, perfectly consistent with the Rome principles. We need to abide by countries' decisions and strengthen their ability to make good decisions according to their policies. But we also have to look at, given the challenges that we're going to face in the future with climate change, with the need to use resources much more efficiently, we're going to have all the arrows in our quiver, every tool available. So from tissue culture to standard plant breeding to all kinds of technology open to us. So.
I think you raised a lot of really important issues. I think, unfortunately, this issue of food insecurity is incredibly complex. Makes it really difficult to address it in a systematic way. Makes it really difficult to get people to agree on what the right solutions are in order to address it with respect to public policies that you're raising, with respect to farm subsidies, tariffs, or energy policies with respect to biofuels. And I personally have been involved in a lot of advocacy efforts to address and change a lot of those challenges, and it continues to be an ongoing struggle. And what I would say is that, if we fixed all of those policies, we might not change people's livelihoods if we're not investing in agriculture. I don't think investing in agriculture is necessarily just teaching people about things, treating them like they're stupid and they don't know what they're doing. And obviously they've been doing it for generations, but in many cases they don't have the right tools and resources in order to be productive and effective at it. Maybe they don't have enough land, or their soil quality is really poor, and they need that those investments can be about helping them to improve their soil quality, to use conservation practices, to use micro-irrigation or water catchment systems in order to deal with dry, arid, and drought conditions. So I don't think it's just about telling people what to do, but I think it's about giving them a leg up. And with respect to land grabs, I agree. I think it's a huge problem. I think that this is where and why transparency and accountability is really important. I wouldn't go so far as to say things like land deals and investments in land or private sector involvement in agriculture are things that shouldn't happen, but they certainly need rules and regulations, and they certainly need to be looked at in a new light. They need to be looked at for returns on investment to poverty reduction and not just to profit. And I think that getting there is really a challenge, and I think we all need to continue to work on it. I think there are a lot of efforts that are underway in other forums outside of the G8, such as in the Committee on World Food Security that's based in Rome, where there is a huge civil society voice that is continuing to work on these challenges and to try to get the right policies in place. But I don't think that we can. I don't think we can do it all at once, and I think that these are all of these components are necessary to make the whole work.
One last point on the land grabbing issue. I think one of the big wins over the past couple of months has been agreement on responsible agricultural investment principles, and this was an effort that was spearheaded by FAO and the Committee for Food Security and agreed by, I don't know, about 70 countries in the world. I'm not sure the number, but that I think the recent attention to what's happening with land deals and the increased attention to investment in agricultural lands in developing countries has brought that issue in particular to the fore. So I think it's a landmark, that we've got agreement on a framework for responsible agriculture investment, and the countries that have submitted letters of intent to invest in the key countries of the new alliance investments are agreeing to abide by those principles. So, but I agree with Emily that it's all in the transparency and accountability, and up to the G8 and up to the constituency to see how this plays out in practice. But we're beginning to get a framework, much like the Bono talked at the Friday G8 gathering after President Obama, and talked about the importance of the extractive minerals transparency, and essentially saying we need a similar kind of effort for agriculture. So we're beginning to get that framework, and now we need to develop those principles. The countries themselves are also identifying these in the policy targets, the frameworks that we developed with the 3 countries. I think land tenure issues have come up in almost all 3 of them. Shola?
I want to thank the 2 of you for 2 wonderful presentation and perspectives. With respect to the USAID platform for giving aid to countries, it appears that, at least from my perspective, that those aid typically come with conditions that made it difficult for sustainability and development of infrastructure where the needs is greatest, in terms of ensuring that a lot of the consultants, a lot of the goods that are needed are actually from here instead of where they're most needed. So I'm a little encouraged, hoping that in the new USAID disposition, focusing on country need and partnership, accountability, and probably going away from the old NGO model where they just get the money and when the money is finished, they pack up and go. I have 2 specific questions. You mentioned 6 countries where I think it was Tanzania, Ethiopia, Ghana, Mozambique, and Burkina Faso, where through a private-public partnership, you have ongoing development in those areas. I'm curious how those selections were made, whether it was really driven by just the private partnerships in those countries that made those decisions happen. And then the second question is related to the decision by USAID to engage academic institutions. I think that's to engage academic institutions, universities, as a place where you can engage our students, where you can have innovation and ideas in terms of training people in some of these countries so that they can take care of their own needs through education about new methods of farming, sharing information about climate change, providing access to weather patterns that may inform how farmers can get the better yield from their I'm interested in the status of the engagement of universities and when that is going to really be unleashed.
Great. Okay. Let me see if I can answer this quickly. Thanks a lot for your comment on what it means to work locally. I didn't talk about it this evening, but USAID Forward is the new policy that Administrator Shah has implemented that's essentially asking our local missions to contract an increasing proportion of services from local organizations rather than from US-based firms or US headquartered NGOs. And really that policy is not without controversy, but I think that it's the right way for us. Obviously, Administrator Shah does as well. It doesn't mean that international consulting firms or international NGOs don't have an important role to play, because many of the organizations that we want to strengthen on the ground lack the financial skills, lack some of the capacity development of their own staff. But it's a question of who's going to be in the driver's seat, and increasingly we're signaling with the way that we're awarding our contracts and the accountability, that responsibility we expect will increasingly rest with local organizations. So so stay tuned on that one. I think it's an important move for us, but it's gotten us a lot of heat in almost every place that I've spoken in Washington. You asked about the 6 countries. How were the selections made? These are These are countries that we have judged in consultation with the G8 partners and also with African Union. And these are countries that have been part of something called the Grow Africa Forum, which is a program of the World Economic Forum and CADUP, the NEPAD agriculture program. So these are countries that have been working, for about a year, trying to signal, right, what are the policies that they would put into place, beginning to have dialogue with international companies as well as local companies to lay the groundwork, and fomenting really discussions between private sector as well as government. So these are the countries that have sort of distinguished themselves as being serious on all counts. It's not a quid pro quo per se, but it's countries that have stepped forward and said, yes, we are wanting to go into a cooperation framework, as the sort of the next step beyond L'Aquila, to attract in more private sector investment, and also, for us to have a more focused strategy and more focused assistance from donor partners in surmounting some of the policy obstacles that we face and infrastructure obstacles. So these are countries from the Grow Africa list. Now, we don't anticipate that the list will stop at 6, right? That we're working with the African Union. In fact, we've had, part of the reason I was late to Chicago today was because we continued to have conversations with African Union about how we will jointly set up a monitoring framework, sort of mutual accountability framework for these initial 3 and then 3 more before the end of the year, and then how African Union will begin to take on this process of selection and planning for, really expect these to be the model for scaling up throughout the continent. I want to add a quick point on Emily's point about monitoring and evaluation. The other meeting I was in this morning was actually a meeting of donors and Rome agencies and the World Bank about harmonizing monitoring and evaluation standards in these countries. I think we've all recognized that we're draining our own resources and draining resources of the countries where we work by having to report in and be accountable to 5 or 6 different, at least, systems. So what can we do to move towards one harmonized system? I think that's going to help your accountability report as well. Engaging academic institutions. Okay, I could take an evening on this, but I won't. I think that's particularly important. That falls in my shop as well. And we're beginning an exercise right now to look at capacity development in a more holistic way. We see, as we have focused our investments on value chains, from research all the way through to consumption, there are lots of needs. One of the private sector, now that they have discovered an interest in investing in poorer countries, the second thing they say is, we have no one to hire. Where are the accountants? Where are the scientists? And we've really fallen far behind. Part of the investments that fell off after the 1970s, were investments in capacity development. This again is an area that we think we really need coordination with other donors in the private sector. So there is a new effort at the World Bank. The World Bank is actually getting back into investment in higher education, and we're anticipating a new project to come out of there, which will have in excess of 100 million available for regional agricultural university investments in Africa. So we've been working alongside that project, several donors in a project that's called the TEAM, Tertiary Education Mechanism for Agriculture. So trying to work through, and we've commissioned a study with I don't know if you know, RUForum is one of the key Africa-based organization that works on curriculum development and training universities in Africa, working with them to figure out, well, where should we be investing? We won't have enough resources to build up universities in every country in agriculture, so how do we invest strategically? What are the models out there? So there's a lot of work to do in that area. We're trying to figure out, it seems like in every area, how we do it in a strategic, coordinated way.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me just take the moderator's prerogative and ask the last question. The other thing that happens, of course, when you engage with universities, they're going to ask you to question some of the basic assumptions behind the analysis that you're doing, and only sort of providing capacity building and workers. So I want to ask about that, and building off one of the previous questions too, because and I'll say, as someone who works on historic and traditional agriculture in rural South India and working with smallholders, I see there is, as a previous questioner alluded to, a kind of, I say, really grim irony in the slow pace of the knowledge on the part of us in the West in thinking about agriculture. And maybe some great humility is needed. So that here we were very busy proselytizing out a kind of industrial model of a green revolution, and suppressing forms of indigenous knowledge, and particularly things like traditional crops, land races, which are in fact bred over hundreds or thousands of years for particular environments and particular contexts. So then now we've begun to rediscover traditional forms of land use, for example, multi-cropping, intercropping, and various kinds of other things, and to teach them to the very people who invented them, right? So there is a kind of a serious and fundamental issue there, but the actual question that I have really has to do again with the public-private partnership and the issues of, let's just stick to one topic, of agrobiodiversity and seed. So if we have a kind of success story of a new crop, sweet potato that has very successful in the video clip, that's specially bred for conditions. It's a little funny that we on the one hand shut out all of the traditional agrobiodiversity that was specially bred for conditions, by farmers over generations, and then we have to create new ones. So in South India, where I work, access to land, obviously water, labor, all these kinds of things are very important for increasing smallholder income, which is a stated goal of the project. And one of those kinds of agricultural inputs, of course, is seed. So here we have a situation in which access to seeds is increasingly controlled by very, very few large multinational corporations. And I'm sure you know that there's been a lot of seed agitations in India and farmer suicides and various other kinds of problems associated with seeds on various sorts. So the government policy, the kind of government strategy relies on these large corporations, but of course the interests of the large corporations is not necessarily the same as the interest of USAID or of the sort of public good, right? So how do you work to try and deal with that very, say quite dangerous alliance, between the government and international organizations which are meant to serve a public interest, and corporations which are all about making profits. So it doesn't surprise me, for example, that fertilizer companies are happy to help smallholders, because it sounds a lot like opening up markets rather than any kind of actual form of assistance. So what is the possibility? What needs to be done in order to provide the kind of safeguards and sort of I'm running out of steam on my question here, so you can jump right in.
Okay. Okay. Well, these are good questions. On the biodiversity front, I think it's kind of funny to get this question. I mean, because we've been trying to defend over years. I mean, U.S. aid investments in research. I mean, sometimes we get pushback from the commodity groups. Why are we helping soybean farmers or maize farmers someplace else? We could be exporting U.S. commodities there. And our argument has always been, I mean, we very much need to maintain relationships for reasons of national security, right? Ours and country's security, so that we get out of this reliance on food aid. But for the very fact that we do rely on biodiversity. I mean, developing countries rely on the diversity here and we there, and increasingly agriculture is very, very globalized in that sense. When you think of the problem of stem rust, which is a very, very terrible threat to wheat worldwide right now. I mean, essentially, you look at how it's crawling across the globe, and this was sort of the last issue that Norm Borlaug took on before his death a couple of years ago. This is an all-hands-on-deck effort, where the U.S. is using its advanced laboratories in Minnesota to identify both potentially infected strains of wheat as they're shipped across the world, but also to help identify what are the sources of resistance. So biodiversity is not an us-them kind of topic. It's essential. We recognize it as essential for the sustainability of our own crops, and to be able to preserve the diversity so that we have that germplasm to draw from whatever scourge should meet us next. I think it's on the sweet potato issue. I actually am. I know that case very well because it's a good friend of mine who's been working on orange fleshed sweet potato, Jan Lowe from the International Center for the Potato, and it's not just a game, I think, of preserving local crops as they were, because I mean, if you look over time, as I'm sure you have, crops change all the time. Right?
But that's the very point of land races, is they're constantly adapting. Right?
And it's not just
it's an evolving process.
It's an evolving process, and importation happens all the time. So a lot of our crops that we planted, corn and tomatoes and all that, came from South America, right? A lot of our root crops that we planted in the American South came from Africa. So there's been this kind of change. So things are changing, and stasis is actually not a great thing. The great innovation about the orange flesh sweet potato, of course, is the biofortification, and the opportunity to deliver, without pills, vitamin A, which can reduce blindness and has all kinds of nutritional benefits. So I think, on the question of the dangerous alliance, international organizations, is technology dangerous? Yes, right? I mean, all technology can be dangerous.
I'm not talking about technology at all. I'm talking about the kind of interests, whether, no matter what the product is, of the public good versus private organizations in meeting these kinds of goals.
Right. So I think the answer to that is not to push away the investment, but to look for ways that we keep the investments transparent, and that we look for the impacts, and that we are sure to strengthen the local organizations, as well as our organizations back here that can track what's actually happening on the ground. So it's not a black and white issue. I think if you were I always bemoan at these kind of that we aren't often able to bring in farmers themselves, although Emily did a pretty good job with her videos, to ask them, what's the opportunity that you would like to have in the future? I'm, as a researcher, looking much better to unlock pipeline technologies, that, things that have been tested, and our international ag research systems publicly funded, and the national ag research systems of Africa. It's been very, very tough, without that connection to the market. So we're looking for the key, going to turn innovation that's going to make the right kinds of innovation available to farmers, but we're also looking at it with eyes open, and make sure that we're understanding what the impacts are without shying away from new things.
Looked quite a bit is actually how little research and development goes into agriculture in non-staple crops. So most of what gets invested in cocoa, these things, but at the end of the day, this isn't really what most people eat all the time. There are very large populations in the developing world that do have a diet that's very full of rice and maize and things like that, but they also eat a much wider variety of grains and legumes, and we don't actually do enough, public or private, in trying to improve these types of crops that people eat, that is actually important for their nutrition, their well-being, their own individual food security. And part of trying to improve, I think, investments in the types of crops that people eat and are important to their communities. Need to be a lot of safeguards, and I would say that particularly when it comes to private sector and public sector investment. And I think that this is something that developing countries can be very important in terms of getting the R&D done actually in the fields of crops of those who are using them to make sure that they meet their own needs. And again, I'll go back to my point about that I think that when you're listening to what people need rather than telling them what they want, I think you're starting from a much better basis. And I think if you couple that with the investments in strengthening both research and other public institutions to have things like biosafety laws and enable communities to be able to have voice and redress when things maybe don't work as they had intended, I think are all, again, pieces of the puzzle to make sure that it's not a dangerous alliance, but a productive alliance.
Yeah, I think my students in the audience here will know that I hate the word traditional agriculture and never use it, because the very understanding of it is that it's a dynamic, evolving, innovative thing. So my point is that I think innovation is not a monopoly solely of Western science, but also comes from farmers themselves on all parts of the world. So please join me in thanking both of our speakers today for
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from the Norman Waite Harris Memorial Fund. Download recordings of other events and learn more about the World Beyond the Headlines series at the Center for International Studies website, cis.uchicago.edu.